This is no longer just a warning. Iran has made its move in the Strait of Hormuz Cape, and the U.S. Navy is now responding.
Only hours after a ceasefire between Washington and Tehran had been announced, that fragile pause started to break apart. A missile strike hit a key Hezbollah-linked district in Beirut. Officially, it was outside the terms of the U.S.-Iran understanding. But in a crisis this tense, timing is everything. And within hours, Iran responded in the most dangerous way possible. Tehran declared the immediate closure of the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping. Then, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps released a maritime exclusion map, showing a red zone stretching directly across the tanker corridor. Iranian military channels warned that the waters had been mined during the conflict. Any tanker trying to cross that zone could trigger a naval mine. But Iran did not seal every route. It left one narrow option open. Commercial ships could still pass through waters near Larak Island, but only under Iranian naval escort, and only after paying a transit fee to Tehran. That changed the meaning of the crisis instantly. The Strait of Hormuz was no longer being presented as an international passage. It was being turned into a controlled corridor, one monitored by force and regulated by Iran. Minutes after that warning, the tactical picture started changing. Radar operators began picking up new surface contacts moving into the area. At first, the returns looked ordinary. Small fishing boats, slow civilian traffic. Nothing unusual for these waters. But then the pattern changed. One contact became several. Several became many more. On thermal displays, the sea began filling with white signatures spreading across the corridor. And it was not just the number of boats that raised alarms. It was how they were moving. Their patterns were too deliberate, too coordinated, too structured to be random. Fast patrol craft, escort boats, and possible armed platforms appeared to be operating among civilian fishing traffic. The corridor was no longer simply closed. It was being actively controlled in real time. Then, analysts overlaid those movements against the main tanker route. The result was immediate. These vessels had been running repeated loops across the same narrow stretch of water, stopping, turning, and repositioning with unusual precision. There was only one conclusion that fit the pattern. Mines had likely been placed across the shipping lane. That changed everything. At that point, this was no longer just political signaling. It became an operational crisis. One successful mine strike on a supertanker could paralyze the strait within minutes, disrupt global oil movement, and send energy markets into panic. The red zone near Larak Island no longer looked like a warning. It looked like a calculated choke point. And that is what made this so dangerous. By closing the main route and forcing commercial traffic toward waters controlled by Iran, Tehran had turned geography into leverage. Every tanker seeking safe passage could now be forced into an Iranian-controlled channel. Every transit could mean fees. Every delay could send oil prices higher. Every hour of uncertainty could increase pressure on governments far beyond the Gulf. This was not just military pressure. It was economic coercion wrapped in naval power. Inside the U.S. Navy command picture, the problem was immediately obvious. Iranian small boats were mixed in with legitimate civilian traffic. Some were probably ordinary fishing vessels. Others may have been operating under IRGC direction. And that gray zone mix was the entire strategy. The United States could not simply treat every small Iranian boat as hostile. Doing that could itself trigger the collapse of the ceasefire. That meant every radar track, every visual contact, and every movement had to be identified before any action could be taken. The sea was no longer just contested. It had become politically trapped. So the U.S. response began to form in layers. An amphibious ready group shifted into defensive posture. Marines moved onto the decks. Weapons checks began. Communications were verified. Boarding teams and rapid response units prepared for deployment. This was no longer a routine patrol. The United States was preparing to push major naval presence into one of the most sensitive waterways on Earth. Destroyers formed the outer screen. The amphibious group held the center. Marines stood ready for escort missions, interdiction, boarding operations, and emergency response. The message was unmistakable. If Iran was trying to redefine the strait by force, the U.S. Navy was preparing to challenge that control without becoming the side that openly broke the ceasefire. Above the ships, another layer of force was already ready. F-35B Lightning II fighters sat armed on deck, and that immediately changed the balance. The F-35B gives an amphibious force much more than air cover. It brings precision strike capability, electronic warfare support, and persistent surveillance over the entire corridor. If a hostile drone, missile battery, or fast attack craft moved into the battle space, these aircraft could be airborne in minutes. Now the American response was no longer centered only at sea. Air and sea power were fully linked. Behind the stealth fighters, Marine assault elements were also preparing to move. V-22 Ospreys stood ready on deck, built for fast insertion across the strait. Troops boarded. Equipment was locked in. Crew chiefs completed final checks. Rotors tilted into launch position. The force package was now clear. Destroyers securing the sea. F-35Bs controlling the sky. Ospreys ready to move Marines anywhere the situation demanded. The fleet was no longer just observing the crisis. It was preparing to enter it. And beyond the immediate battle space, even more American naval power was shifting toward the region. A carrier strike group began moving closer to the Middle East. This was not symbolic. A carrier group changes the scale of the crisis. It brings strike aircraft, escort ships, missile defense, electronic warfare, layered command capability, and the mass needed to dominate a maritime theater. That kind of movement sends only one message. The United States is preparing for a crisis that may get worse before it gets better. The numbers involved also mattered. This was not a token deployment or a show-the-flag operation. It represented a regional force posture, with large numbers of Marines and naval personnel capable of boarding, escorting, securing, and, if necessary, fighting for control of the corridor. Every layer of the response was being reinforced. And across the region, everyone understood what that meant. If the strait was threatened, Washington was signaling that it had both the manpower and the firepower to keep it open. At the tactical level, movement across the task force accelerated. Helicopters began lifting personnel between ships and forward positions. Command staff, boarding teams, rapid response elements, all repositioned wherever the threat seemed to be emerging. That gave the fleet flexibility. Units could be shifted quickly onto destroyers, amphibious platforms, or directly into response operations inside the strait itself. The posture was no longer static. It had become fully mobile. At the same time, forces on the ground also moved into readiness. Marine units and supporting personnel prepared for coastal security and fast response missions. This mattered because if the crisis expanded beyond the waterway, key coastal positions, loading terminals, and forward operating sites could become part of the next phase. By this point, the American response covered every domain that mattered: sea, air, and ground. But before any fleet could fully secure the Strait of Hormuz, there was one problem that had to be solved first. The water itself had to be made safe. Mine countermeasure teams moved into the corridor. Sonar began scanning the seabed. Every suspicious shape was flagged. Every shadow below the surface was treated like a potential weapon. Then came confirmation. The first mine was identified. A demolition charge moved into place. Seconds later, the sea erupted in a controlled blast, sending a white column of water into the air. One mine destroyed, then another, then another. Lane by lane, the corridor began to reopen. That was the final barrier between the fleet and the strait. Until the mines were cleared, no serious maritime operation could move safely through the area. And that is exactly why the mining threat was so powerful. A mined Strait of Hormuz, combined with a so-called safe passage route through Iranian-controlled waters, gives Tehran maximum leverage over global oil traffic. It creates political pressure, financial opportunity, and strategic influence all at once. And for Iran, clearing that threat voluntarily would mean giving up one of its strongest bargaining chips. That is why the chance of a quick, peaceful reversal remains low. Meanwhile, Washington kept increasing the pressure. American officials continued making it clear that a ceasefire is not a free pass for coercion. The strait must reopen. Commercial shipping must move safely. And no global tanker traffic should be forced under IRGC escort or made to pay Iranian transit fees. Those statements were backed not just by words, but by everything happening on the water. More U.S. naval assets kept moving into the region. Carrier groups were either in position or nearing it. Amphibious formations remained loaded with Marines and combat aircraft. The military footprint around Iran was still growing, not shrinking. And on the other side, Iran was not backing down either. Red zone maps remained active. Small boat traffic continued to grow. Pressure on the strait was being reinforced rather than reduced. There was no visible sign of withdrawal, no sign of compromise, no clear signal that either side was ready to step back. Which is why this no longer looks like a crisis moving toward peace. It looks like both sides are digging in. It looks like pressure is building from both directions. And it looks like the next move may decide whether this stays a controlled standoff or turns into a direct confrontation in the world's most dangerous oil corridor. For now, the ceasefire still exists. But in the Strait of Hormuz, peace is measured in hours. And the next move could change everything.